Well, our gospel lesson today comes from Mark 10, a continuation of that 10th chapter, and these are the final verses of that 10th chapter. The last 4 weeks in the Upside Down Kingdom sermon series have all been from this chapter, and this is the conclusion of that. Listen for God's word for you. Jesus and his followers came into Jericho. As Jesus was leaving Jericho together with his disciples and a sizable crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, Timaeus' son, was sitting beside the road. When he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was there, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy." Many scolded him, telling him to be quiet. But he shouted even louder, "Jesus, Son of David, show me mercy." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him forward." They called to the blind man, "Be encouraged, get up, he's calling you." Throwing his coat to the side, he jumped up and he came to Jesus. Jesus asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "Teacher, I want to see." Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." And at once he was able to see, and he began to follow Jesus on the way. This is the word of the Lord. Do you ever notice that when you travel the same route over and over, maybe it's the route you took to church today, maybe it's your daily commute, that you begin assigning waypoints of significance, like this is the halfway point of this journey. Or this, when I see this, it means I'm getting really close. Or you see something and you feel like it marks a different section of the journey. It can happen as simple as something as a daily commute. For me, that route that I take frequently is my route to work here, and I see John B. Dennis Highway, and I think that's the halfway point. I have no clue if it's actually the halfway point or not, but in my mind, when I drive under John B. Dennis on my way here, I think I'm halfway to church. When we drive over to Asheville, I think of crossing over Sam's Gap as that halfway point. When you go over the crest, and a whole different part of the journey begins. In fact, a whole different state begins. I know I've said this before, but as a kid growing up in southern Illinois and traveling over to St. Louis, there was this tiny little town called Oakville. It was this one small town in the midst of a great sea of soybean fields, and it had one little Dairy Queen in it, and I always knew that was the halfway point in my mind. Or I've said this before, I know when we were traveling to St. Louis, when we saw the arch from many, many miles away, I knew we were getting close. So I have a question for you. In your mind, what do you think the halfway point between here and Knoxville is? What's the point that you say, oh, we're halfway there? What do you think? Okay, I hear like 30 different things. I'm going to try to pick them out. Somebody said Morristown. Does anyone here just think Morristown in general? Some people said, I heard some people back here say where the interstates meet, where 81 meets forward. And then I heard all the way in the back, I heard Ed Stanford's very clear voice say, Exit 8. Does anyone else think Exit 8? That was the very specific answer Dave Smith gave in early worship. Well, we all might have different ones. I think Morristown's a pretty common one, or where the exits meet, where the interstates meet. But we mentally assign this is the halfway point in this journey. The journey begins a little bit differently after that point. Now, if I were to say this is the waypoint that says to you, oh, we're getting close to Knoxville, what would you say that is?
Strawberry Farm.
Okay. Strawberry Pines. Would anyone say Sevierville? No, I suggested in the early service, and is Linda here? No, Linda Golder said, no, responded very loudly. No, I admitted to them that I used to think it was Sevierville, but when I first moved here, I didn't know how to pronounce that. I kept saying Sevierville or Sevierville, and people kept looking at me like, what are you talking about? We assign those things where we feel like we're almost there. Now, if you're coming back, what would it be? What would it be that you are almost home? Coming back from Knoxville, what's the sign you're almost home?
Fall Branch.
Fall Branch, is that what you said? Fall Branch? Some people said Tri-Cities Crossing. For me, it's something oddly specific. It is when I see the cell phone tower that I know is on the property of Vanette Vance, the Vance family, who's longtime members of this church. When I see that, I know we're getting close. Jericho, the place in today's story, would have functioned as one of those markers because it was incredibly close to Jerusalem. It was a distinct place. Do you know that Jericho is the lowest city in the world, 846 feet below sea level? Check out this amazing weather. The average high in June, July, a cool 101. And not only that, Jericho continues to be the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. It's been inhabited more than 9,000 years. So 2,000 years ago, still had been 7,000 years into its existence. Luke's gospel is where Zacchaeus, the wee little man, the tax collector, climbs up the tree to see Jesus. The road between Jerusalem and Jericho was the setting for Jesus' famous parable of the Good Samaritan. It was an incredibly significant place. To anyone reading or hearing this story of Jesus' life, this story would have been significant. Oh, it's in Jericho. Oh, we're getting close to Jerusalem. It's a waypoint. It's a marker. From there, the journey was going to be very different. No longer is Jesus up north in Galilee with these poor fishermen and their poor fisher towns. We're getting close to the seat of power, close to the movers and the shakers, close to the temple, close to the place where many assumed Jesus could start his revolution. And not only, the story doesn't just take place in Jericho, it takes place as they're leaving Jericho to head to Jerusalem. Next stop, Jerusalem. In fact, if we would just read one verse further into Mark 11, we see Jesus entering into Jerusalem. Now, scholars have always seen that this story was the bookend of a section of Mark's gospel that began back in chapter 8 with Jesus in Bethsaida on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where he healed a nameless blind man by spitting in his eyes. They saw that as the beginning of this section that ended here in Jericho. So the story, it's in a significant location. It's at the end of this section of stories where disciples just don't seem to get it, and there's something unique going on. Mark has all these healing stories in this section, but there's only one person that is named, that actually is given a name in all those healing stories. Sure, we hear about Jairus and Jairus' daughter, but we don't know Jairus' daughter's name. And all these other healing stories were nameless, faceless individuals, but not in this one. It's Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. That's what it means, Bartimaeus. It's an Aramaic name. It means son of honor. Throughout this whole section of Mark, from the blind man to blind Bartimaeus, Jesus seems to be dealing with these different types of blindness. Physical blindness, what causes men to be outcast and beg, to not have their sight. But we're also talking about spiritual blindness, which causes men, and specifically the apostles, to be unable to know who Jesus truly is and how this kingdom works. And here, this irony is on full display. This son of honor, Bartimaeus, has more spiritual sight than the crowd traveling with Jesus. Though he may not be able to see the crowds or see Jesus' face, he clearly sees who Jesus is. Son of mercy, show me mercy. Son of David, show me mercy. Son of David, that's a term reserved for the Messiah. You know, the Messiah that would bloom from Jesse's root, that would come from David's lineage. He wasn't just pointing out Jesus' heritage, his family, his background. He was literally calling Jesus the Messiah, a dangerous thing to be yelling so close to Jerusalem. What's unique is this story contains elements of all the other stories from this section and all the other stories we've covered in this series of the Upside Down Kingdom. Just like the little children from the first week, Bartimaeus had people attempting to silence him and to keep him away from Jesus. And yet we see Bartimaeus accepting Jesus' kingdom like a child because he came to Jesus with desperation. He shouted over the crowds. He would not be silenced because he knew that it was only Jesus that could truly save him. And then a couple weeks ago, the story of the rich man who wanted to follow Jesus. This devout rich man who desperately wanted to follow Jesus, so much that he pulled up his robes and he ran to Jesus and he kneeled at him. Remember, he was the best of that community. And yet he could not bring himself to give all that he had so he could follow Jesus. In contrast to that, Bartimaeus didn't have a lot. He just had the clothes on his back and his outer garment, a coat or an outer layer of a tunic. It was common practice for beggars to use that coat as a way of collecting their alms. They would lay it down in front of them. That's where people who saw these beggars would throw their change. And so all he had was this coat. All he had was the money that was laying in that coat. That's all the money he had in the world. And when Jesus calls him forward, he takes the coat and he throws it away. He didn't flinch. He didn't wait. He throws away all his worldly possessions to the other beggars. And he's led up to Jesus. And he was healed. Last week, James and John were jockeying for position in God's kingdom, trying to trick Jesus to give them anything they wanted. James and John, what would you have me do? What would you ask of me? God, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, will you let us sit at your left hand and your right hand? They wanted these positions of honor and prestige. They wanted to be considered great. But Jesus taught them that in order to be great, they had to be a servant. In order to be the best, they had to be a slave to all. So when Jesus said to Bartimaeus, what would you have me do for you? Same question. Bartimaeus, by contrast, he's got no aspirations of greatness. He's just simply about finding wholeness, saving, that Greek word sozo, to save. We hear that and we can't help but think of all of our Reformed traditions and all the years of evangelicalism around us where we think of being saved as God saving our souls. But in the Greek sense, that word was used as a completeness. Saving meant saving, healing, restoring your physical needs and your spiritual needs. And that's what he found in Jesus, wholeness, healing. He found complete satisfaction. In fact, that last line we hear is he immediately followed Jesus. And those of us, we know the story, knows he's almost to Jerusalem, and we know what happens there. But I think today's story, in addition to highlighting those other points, makes its own point. I think it's always a helpful thing to ask, who are we in this story? Are we Bartimaeus, desperately seeking God so much that we will not be silenced, desperately seeking to do God's will and not settling for no, not settling for being ignored? Or are we the disciples or the crowd who ignore the marginalized, who ignore them because we can't see their value or they make us uncomfortable, or even worse, we actively try to silence them? Perhaps you're like me and you see a little bit of yourself in both. Cultural observers have pointed out that over the years, our nation, our culture has largely become a culture of spectators. Instead of playing the sport, we watch the sport. Instead of going to the game, we watch it on TV. Instead of participating in theater and acting out plays, we watch the play. Instead of creating music or joining choral groups or bands, we just listen to the music. The church is not immune from this phenomenon. Much of our time, we'd rather have someone perform for us in worship, perform the music, listen to their beautiful singing instead of us actually singing ourselves, or sit back and watch others perform the liturgy, the prayers, and the readings for us. There's also this notion that We can engage in mission and service, but we do it in a way that does not require painful, courageous personal interactions. Like we feel it's our job to construct the machine to answer the problems of homelessness and hunger or any other problem that the last and the least would have. And we construct the machine, the organization, the system, and let that well-run machine fulfill that call to love and to serve the last and the least. And when it does that, I don't have to interact with someone in a desperate situation. I won't have to interact with someone struggling with addiction. I won't have to interact with someone who has mental health issues. I won't have to deal with any of that unsavoriness. The system, the organization, the ministry will handle it. So it's just my job to support the system and just sit back and spectate after that. Some might even call it slacktivism, the combination of the word, the portmanteau of slack and activism. It's a new term that's emerged over the past couple years that highlights a particular dangerous element of our spectator culture. It's performative. It's adorning ourselves often online with the mantle of someone who really cares about these things, but does relatively little to actually help accomplish it. See, I think in this age of mass communication, some might call it the age of misinformation or missing information, we are tricked into thinking we actually do more than we actually do. So search yourself. How much time and priority do you dedicate to pursuing God's call in your life? Have you too easily accepted the silence? The story of Bartimaeus is the story of one who moved from the sidelines to the playing field. The question that this story asks of us is, what is keeping us on the sidelines? What's keeping us from fully engaging this upside-down kingdom? You see, I think it's entirely possible, if not probable, that the problem with the church these days isn't that it's asking too much of people. But terrifyingly enough, I think the problem is we're probably asking too little of each other and ourselves. And so here at the bookend of this series, at the bookend of this section of Mark, as we exit Jerusalem, as we exit Jericho to enter and head towards Jerusalem, we are challenged to be more than just spectators in Jesus' upside-down kingdom. Jesus is calling us to get up, to leave everything behind, and to embrace the wholeness that he offers, and to follow him. Amen.